Yo, I'm Bob. Into Marvel, happen to be totally blind since birth, talking about Spider-Man the Animated Series Season 1, Episode 11, The Hobgoblin Part 1. So, Part 1 of The Hobgoblin premiered on May 20th in 1995. It is the 11th episode of the series overall, so I would see Part 1 when it premiered that May, but I'd have to wait around 2 to 2.5 months to catch part two when it aired in reruns on Saturday. For some reason, I would miss part two that following weekend, but I love this two-parter so much. In terms of Spider-Man stories, it is undoubtedly one of my favorites because of the character we're introduced to, all the weapons that he gets to wield, as well as all the backstabbing, all the bad guy backstabbing that goes on during this two-parter. It is just, I think, a fantastic story. So you've got Norman Osborn. He has had it up to here with Wilson Fisk, or Kingpin. So he's been having to work for Kingpin for the majority of season one. Well, we haven't seen Osborn since the Spider Slayer two-parter, but since then, he has to do whatever Kingpin tells him to do. Kingpin pretty much, I think, probably owns Oscorp. I think Osborn has to run a ton of things by Fisk. I would imagine Fisk is getting quite a lot of Osborn's money at this point. Because when you strike a bargain with the Kingpin, and if you don't follow through, you're pretty much having to do what he tells you to do until he says otherwise. So I love how this part one begins, where you've got the Hobgoblin here, and he is voiced by the legendary Mark Hamill. I'll get into something that I theorized when I was a kid. Of course, it didn't come through, but we'll get into that probably at the end of the part two review. But yeah, I love how you get to see Hobgoblin at the beginning of the two-parter. He is gearing up to unalive the Kingpin. And I love this because he's cackling as he gets on his glider and he flies into action. And you have this this unveiling of the Fisk School of Criminology at Empire State University. And I like that we as viewers are introduced to that other side of Fisk, because so far we've pretty much seen his Kingpin side of his dual nature. We don't see him doing a lot of things in the public eye, but I like how Smythe, at the beginning of the episode, he's like, I don't understand why you have to do all this stuff. Why are you going to this thing? And he's like, well, nobody can suspect what I do in the dark. They can't suspect my real occupation. So, Fisk is donating a lot of money to ESU so they can open that school of criminology. And unbeknownst to him, you have Hobgoblin, who's going to be showing up to the unveiling. And I like how Hobgoblin kind of levels up as the two-parter progresses. When we first see him at the beginning of the episode, he's just got a glider and he's got a laser pistol, I think, or some kind of laser rifle. And as Fisk is making his speech, he tries to unalive him, if YouTube will let me use that word. And I like how Peter is there, not in the suit or anything, but his spider sense goes off and he pushes, unbeknownst to him, one of his biggest enemies right out of the way. And so he saves Fisk's life here. And I like how that is going to come into play in a few seasons. So Fisk never really dispenses with anything that happens to him. He kind of stores this away, and he does develop a use for Peter Parker in season 3. But yeah, for now, I mean, he's not happy with what happened to him. He's trying to figure out who in the heck wants him unalived. And I like how it's revealed after Hobgoblin's failed attempt that he is indeed working for Norman Osborn. And this is where we first see, Norman developing the goblin weapons that he'll later use as a Green Goblin. But yeah, he's hired Hobby to unalive the Kingpin, and he has failed Norman. But Hobgoblin being Hobgoblin, he still wants his money because, how was he to know that Spider-Man would get involved? Of course, he gets no money from Osborn, so opportunist that Hobgoblin is, he's going to go behind Norm's back, and he's going to head to Crime Central. and strike a deal with the Kingpin because he's not happy with no money. So he decides to go behind Norman's back. Meanwhile, in the private life of Peter Parker, you've got Peter, and it's this whole subplot where he's attempting to move out of Aunt May's house. He's going to move in with his buddy Harry, and I like how Norman is going to be paying the rent at this apartment. So you've got Peter, who's offered this cushy new apartment overlooking Central Park. So he and Harry meet at the School of Criminology unveiling before all the stuff goes down. And so you've got Gary Imhoff back as Harry Osborn in this episode. We haven't seen him since the Spider Slayer two-parter, I don't think. And you've got Neil Ross back as Norman Osborn. And so I think one of my favorite parts of the episode is when Hobgoblin finds out who Kingpin really is, and he's heard rumblings of Crime Central. It's apparently something that criminals tend to tell themselves. I imagine them talking about it like they talk about a boogeyman around a campfire. Not that criminals would sit around campfires, but you know what I mean. Kind of like a ghost story that they would tell each other. Rumors that they've heard about Crime Central and the mysterious individual who runs it. But Hobgoblin, he finds out who Kingpin really is. I wish they would kind of provide some audio description as to how this goes down. He somehow manages to sneak past all of Kingpin's defenses. Well, I think Kingpin's actually watching him as he enters, but he's trying to figure out who Hobgoblin is, what he's all about. And I like how straightforward Hobgoblin is. He's like, look, man, I want to work for you. And Kingpin is just tickled to death that Hobgoblin would want to work for him. And I like how he says, well, man, we should just lower our weapons, and I want to listen to what this guy has to say. He reminds me of myself rather, as a young man. So Smythe, being Smythe, he is not too happy with this. He knows how ambitious Hobgoblin is, and he does warn his boss, hey, this guy is an opportunist. He'll turn on you. You need to watch out for him. I wouldn't trust this guy at all. And, Kingpin is not really taking Hobgoblin seriously, I would imagine, because of the mask and the cape. And I think as the conversation is going on, this is when the Hobgoblin gets his pumpkin bombs. I don't think he has them at the beginning of the episode. So he has the glider and the gun from Norman, but I think Fisk actually provides him with the pumpkins. And I would imagine Fisk probably got those pumpkin bombs from Norman somehow. I would imagine a lot of the weaponry that Fisk gets is probably designed by Osborn in this incarnation. I don't know that for sure, but I always suspected that Osborn provided a lot of the firepower that Fisk's men tend to wield in this animated series. Because Osborn loves building weapons, apparently. So you've got Hobgoblin revealing that he worked for Norman because Norman's not paying him, so now Hobgoblin is double-crossing Norman. And I love how much of an opportunist Hobgoblin is in the animated series. He is out for himself. As long as he gets a lot of money and a lot of firepower, he's fine. Any chance he can get to use something against someone else in this show, he's going to take it. And I really like Mark Hamill's portrayal of Hobgoblin. So when I first saw this two-parter, I don't think I knew the name Mark Hamill. I knew who Luke Skywalker was. Mom probably told me who played Luke, I think. She might have mentioned that when I saw Empire Strikes Back for the first time a couple years prior to seeing this episode. To me, he was just a really cool bad guy. And, you've got him showing up at the new apartment, kidnapping Harry for Kingpin. And this, of course, well, we think it sends Aunt May into a kind of seizure, and then she goes into a coma. But, it's not because of all the action at the apartment at all. We find out in part 2 it's because of the mess. So she's down for the count, and Peter is, of course, very upset with Hobgoblin, who he believes to have caused Aunt May to go into this of this mental state as part one continues. But it's a really action-packed scene there. He just nabs Harry and flies off with him. And then Kingpin, being Kingpin, he doesn't want to pay Hobby either. He's like, look, you're going to work for me until I say otherwise. You'll be paid when I say you will be paid. So no one wants to pay Hobgoblin. So what does Hobgoblin do? He turns around and he goes right back to Norman as part one continues, because now he's got something to use against the Kingpin, and he has his eye on a rather large prize, which is Kingpin's seat of power. So he heads back to Oscorp, and I like this scene here because he suspects that Norman has better weaponry. So he's not really happy with the glider, with the pumpkins, with the gun that he's using. He wants something a lot bigger. So he decides to strike up a deal with Norman, opportunist that he is. And this is where we're introduced to Norman's wing bomber. And I didn't know that this thing was a separate piece until I got the toy around a year after seeing this episode for the first time. Funny story, the wing bomber was on sale. I think the box was half open, but I bought it and all the parts were with it and everything at a Toys R Us. Nobody wanted it. It was on clearance, I guess. And I mean, this thing was such a cool piece of artillery in the show. And this Hobgoblin weapon is such a toyetic piece. I mean, Norman was describing everything that it had, and the toy actually has everything that Norman is describing. It had the smart bombs, it had the discs that we see firing from each wing, the sawtooth discs at the end of the episode, because I mean, Spider-Man, he decides to follow Hobgoblin, because he does put two and two together and figure out that Hobgoblin was there to capture Harry, so he must be going after Norman. So toward the end of the episode, we get a confrontation with Spidey and the Hobgoblin. And I mean, there's really not a lot of fighting in part one. It's mostly Hobgoblin trying to double cross everybody out for himself. I mean, you do see some of Peter Parker, but it's mostly focusing on this bad guy, which I just loved. And at the end of the episode, I like how he's trying out his new weapon. He can control the wing bomber, his much larger weapon, as he flies on his smaller glider, but he can also connect the glider to the wing bomber, as we see at the end of part one. Or he can connect it and disconnect it, and he can actually use the wing as a separate weapon, so he can have a double team going on. So he's firing all kinds of discs and throwing pumpkin bombs at Spider-Man as they're battling toward the end of part one. And I love how the end of part one goes down, because Spider-Man is about to be demolished by the smart bombs, as we are treated to the big to be continued flashing across our screen, along with Mark Hamill's Hobgoblin-y laugh as the episode comes to a close. And I mean, some folks had to wait a week to see part two, but I had to wait 2.5 months because I don't remember why I missed it that following weekend. Like I said, maybe I went out of town, but I would give part one a definite 10 out of 10. I loved all of the twists and turns that the plot takes, especially Hobgoblin just going back and forth, trying to see who will pay him the most, who will give him the best weapons, because at the end of the day, for Hobgoblin, I think it's about power, it's about wielding the biggest weapon, it's about having the most money, and of course now, unbeknownst to Kingpin, he's going to be going after him in part two. Kingpin has no idea he's got this amazing new wing bomber, and it's a real treat to actually watch the Hobgoblin go against Kingpin and pretty much trash Crime Central in part two. But we'll get into that in the next video. One last thing, I think one of Kingpin's weaknesses, at least in this incarnation, is that I think he underestimates the Hobgoblin. He just sees the guy as just another nut in a mask, but Hobgoblin is a very manipulative individual, and it's going to take everybody working together to stop him in the conclusion of this Hobgoblin duology. And I really like what this sets up, because you don't know who the Hobgoblin is as the episode begins. We don't find out who he really is until season 3. So I think that is something that I'll go into in part 2 as to who I thought he was because of that familiar voice that's coming out of Hobgoblin. But anyway, that'll be for the next video, and I will hear you guys then.